Think that's us?
Does anyone know anyone who's not here who's coming?
That's everyone. All right. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
Today we're going to do things a bit differently than I would normally. I'm going to go off a checklist. Which is pretty strange for me.
You've never had one before.
I don't think I've ever had one before. And the main reason why I want to do that is because I'm trying to put together a slideshow, which will be like a summary of this kind of talk over the coming months. And so I'm sort of working on that slideshow. So I'm using you as guinea pigs. I should probably call you pigs, but as what can we call it? Test cases. I'll call you test cases to see how we go with this presentation in terms of the order that I'm presenting it. The main reason why I'm doing that is that at some stage I'd like to produce little 15-minute videos with sort of slices of truth in them, and then people can easily watch a 15-minute video. And Mary and I will get around to that at some point, but we're pretty busy at the moment. But that's our goal. And some of the information I want to present today sort of will make up some of that information that I want to put in those kind of videos. So you get to, and a lot of this stuff many of you may have heard before. Some of you might not have heard some of the things I'm going to discuss with you at all, because I don't think I've mentioned some of the things. This is more of an introductory presentation. So when I say an introductory presentation, obviously I'm not going to present all the details about what I say, but because every single line I pretty much present to you could have a day or up to a week's discussion, really, in the end. So sometimes I'm going to present a line of information, give you 5 minutes to ask a few questions about it, and then we'll just move on to the next subject as an intro, sort of bearing in mind that this is an introductory presentation about fundamental truths about how God made the universe and you. So that's the main focus today. So I think on the website, Mary called it human life and life after, human life on earth and after death for this first phase of this presentation. I don't think we will get to the second part of it today, given the fact that I'm experimenting with you. We might have to have a second day to get to the second part of it. Does that make sense? We'll see how it goes. So the main thing I wanted to do, the reason why I wanted to do this is that I find a lot of people have not had a lot of people who hear divine truth, they sort of hear it through different channels. They might hear it from a friend, or they look at a video online and then they hear a certain subject that appealed to them. They might have been firstly looking at something to do with disease, or something to do with health, or something to do with progress or love. And so most people who come to divine truth have come to it through lots of different means. They haven't come through it all through the same means. And so most of them have missed out on introductory information. Information that is really important for you to understand if you want to understand what we teach completely in terms of what God's truth is, universal truth is completely. You really need a foundation course on some fundamental principles, and then once you have that sort of foundation course, you can then ask deeper questions and we can go into deeper subjects that way. But having the foundation is an essential part of establishing any education for any group of people. So fundamentally, what we do, Mary and I, is we are educating people about all of God's creations, of which you are one, and the universe obviously is another. And we have a very scientific approach to that education. So it's not like a religious approach to the education, it's a scientific approach to the education. The reason why that is because everything God's created is mathematical. It's based on mathematical principles, or you could call them laws of truth. And so the fundamental thing we need to talk about really first with any introduction is the principles relating to truth. So what I'm going to call this is an introduction to truth, the first part. on earth today, a lot of people don't really believe in truth. You know, they think that there's no such thing as absolute truth. There's no such thing as there being a truth that all of us at some point will need to agree upon. The average person sort of believes that I have a truth and you have a truth, and I know some things and you know some other things, and sometimes we think we know the same things. We think we know things about the same subject, but frequently we have different opinions. So, and the average spiritual perspective, particularly when it comes to New Age circles and philosophical circles, such as the Hindu faith and the Buddhist faith, which are very philosophical in their nature, the average opinion in those religious faiths is that I'm allowed to have a truth and you're allowed to have a truth, and they can be different on the same subject. Right? This is not a fundamental truth at all. The universal truth is there is only one truth about everything. One truth on every individual subject. One thing is true, and all the other things are various degrees of error put together, generally speaking, or in some cases, completely error with no truth in them at all. And so we need to first come to grasp, if we're ever going to search for truth in our life, we've got to come to grasp the idea of the concept of absolute truth. In other words, there is only one truth about, well, infinite subjects, of course, but there is only one truth about every one of those infinite subjects. So this is an important fundamental principle that we must come to grasp if we are seekers of truth. The average person on earth gives up seeking truth because they get presented with lots and lots of different so-called truths, with lots of course, emotions of the presenters of those truths involved in it generally too, where, you know, some people get very flamed up, you know, you could say, even potentially angry about you disagreeing with them about what their version of truth is versus what they view the truth to be. Of course, the absolute truth doesn't have rage in it. So it doesn't care whether you know it or not. It doesn't have any, you could say, emotional response to whether you know something or not. In fact, all of us could not know the thing, and yet that truth would still exist. So the truth existing is not dependent on human knowledge or somebody knowing it. So just write that down. Not dependent on human knowledge. So this is very, very important to understand because, you know, many people sort of on earth believe that unless a number of people, usually the majority of people, agree on a subject, then it means that there is really no truth on that subject. All right? So an example of that is everybody on earth when I say everybody, I'm using this very loosely, this term, because some people don't even believe in this, but most people on earth believe in the law of gravity, the truth of gravity. You experience it every day sensorially, you have the feelings of it every day, you are tied to the earth, you don't fly out into space, but even though we're travelling at 1,000 or so kilometres an hour around, you know, at any one point in time, we're already travelling above 1,000 kilometres an hour on this earth, where even if you're standing still, because the earth is spinning. And so fundamentally, if the earth was spinning and there was no gravity, then you would actually, through centrifugal force, fly out into outer space, wouldn't you? So most people on earth, and you could say everybody physically, or you could say everybody physically accepts it, even though they may not believe in it. So they physically accept it because they're governed by it. They actually live by it. They're actually living on earth because of it. If there was no gravity on earth, there'd be no atmosphere on earth, and there would also be no humans surviving on earth. So we're all living as a consequence of that truth, if you like, that principle, that law. And so even if you disagree with the law, you are still living in harmony with it, whether you agree with it or not. You are forced to agree with the law one way or another. All you can do is attempt disobedience to a law. So in other words, I can get up on top of the big building and jump off and try that, but it's only going to be a very temporary attempt, isn't it? Because the law will grab hold of you, rush you towards the ground, and depending on how high the building was, well, that will depend upon how many broken bones or whether death has arrived and of the human body. And so you can see the law has its effect whether you believe in it or not. The law is always going to be governing you. And so the law is, you could say, the absolute truth. So this concept of absolute truth is also the concept of law. Law governs us. Now, humans, when they find a law that they didn't know about before, they can then use that law to their advantage. So this is the beauty of knowledge. The more knowledge you have, so here we're not talking about the truth, because the truth exists whether you know about it or not. But when you know about it, in other words, when you're educated and you have knowledge about that truth, now you can use that truth to your advantage. But you can't really use a truth to your advantage without really knowing it well, because you might only know a few things about it, but you might not know everything about it. And frequently we see the results of this on earth where humans thought they knew a certain thing about the truth about a law, and they engaged that law only to find the whole thing explodes on them because they didn't know everything about that particular truth. So it's very important to gain knowledge, and the thing you're gaining knowledge about is what is the absolute truth about a thing. So from the point of view of the principle of truth, we're basically saying that it's absolute and it's universal and it's mathematical and scientific. And it governs everything, whether the things are conscious of that governance or not. So an example of being conscious of the governance, well, humans to some degree can be conscious of the governance of the law, because we can learn about the law and learn about its effects and learn about its causes and so forth. But like an ant, it's got laws governing its life and its existence, but it's not conscious, not self-conscious, so not able to sort of work out anything. It just lives by it. So you could say some things in nature are instinctual consciousness. In other words, consciousness built into the law, built into the creature, whereas other things are, you could say, will-based consciousness, and that applies to the human to a large degree. So the human is the only will-based creature, and so therefore will-based consciousness is also available to you. So there's a difference between instinctual consciousness and will-based consciousness. So an example of that for the human is you are instinctually conscious that there is a gravity, but you may not intellectually or emotionally know about it or even agree with it. But instinctually, it's there governing your life still. And instinctually, you're putting one foot in front of the other when you walk, and instinctually, you don't fly off into outer space from doing that. So you're governed by the law, but most people don't even think about that. But when you start thinking about it, now you can learn more about the law. So once you start pondering and thinking and searching for the truth of it, you can now learn more about it and potentially learn things about it that help you learn about other laws that can exceed or have hierarchy over that law. You can learn about the hierarchy of laws governing a certain thing. So there is a hierarchy, you could say, of truth, or a hierarchy of laws. And knowledge about the hierarchy is very, very good for a human, because you might be governed by one law, such as gravity, and not know about another law, such as aerodynamics. Right? And then you can, and this was the case for, in the dark ages of the last couple of thousand years, nobody really knew how to fly, right? But once they started to learn about the law that governed flight, because they could see birds doing it, and they could see other creatures flying, and then they thought, it would be great if we could fly. You think about all the advantages we have now. Mary and I are contemplating a trip that's going to be 20,000 kilometres or more in the next couple of months. Imagine trying to do that walking. Or going over the sea and walking and going over the sea and walking. It'd take us, potentially months or even years to do that particular trip. But knowing the hierarchy, that there is this aerodynamics that we can apply the principle of that is greater than the law of gravity under certain conditions. Once we know that is available to us, then obviously we can learn that law to our advantage. Right? So it's very important to understand that the absolute truth, then we can live by it instinctually, and there are certain things that will just function without us really thinking about it if we do so. Or we can examine things more deeply and search for more truths, and that will be to our happiness and advantage. So that's the fundamental principle of absolute truth. Is there any questions you'd like to ask about those things I've mentioned? Very important to understand that it is mathematical and scientific. So here we're not talking about, most people who believe in God would try to tell you that their belief about God which has a certain flavour, is based upon faith. And I'm saying, no, it should not be based upon faith. It should be based upon mathematical and scientific truth. Right? Once it's based on mathematical and scientific truth, you can have faith in it, because there's a certainty about it once it's based on mathematical and scientific truth. But if something is just an idea or a philosophy or a concept, then there's little point in believing in it if it's not established by some kind of mathematical and scientific certainty. So there's not a lot of point in believing in things that are not actually real. You can philosophize about many, many things, but many of the things that you present as philosophies might not be real. So what's the point of even discussing them if that's the case? We're just having, you could say, a spitballing of ideas, but to no real advantage to the human. The real advantage to the human is to know the truth. If you know the truth, now your life, it results in a lot more freedom than before. The truth being the mathematical and scientific certainty of what the absolute truth is about a certain subject. Sandra?
Can I just ask?
That mic's not working. Can you just... No worries.
So with, how you said people that believe in God and don't oftentimes or have what they call faith rather than the mathematical and scientific feeling the evidence of God, is that something like that they're not seeing? We're not looking at the evidence in the universe that God exists in terms of the maths in creation.
Yeah, we'll talk about God's. Last weekend or 2 weeks ago, we talked a lot about God, didn't we? And God's existence and the certainty of God's existence. But it's all mathematical certainty. It's not mystery. And the average religious person believes in a mystery. So if you look at the Christian faith, for example, there's the mystery of the Godhead, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. That's a mystery. And they tell you that you can't even know it because it's a mystery. Well, if you can't know something, that it's not of God, right? Because everything of God is mathematical and scientific. You can see it presented in the universe constantly. So all of the operation of all the stars and the planets and all of the suns, which are the stars, and the movement of bodies in the universe, all of them are governed by law. They're all governed by certainty. This is how they can shoot a rocket from here and get to the moon and come back and still be alive, because there's mathematical certainty in the principles that govern the universe. This also applies to God. There's mathematical certainty. In fact, God, being the source of all mathematics, must be a mathematician because of the certainty that you can see in all creation. Your body works a certain way. This is how a doctor can go into your body and try to fix some things, because he knows a certain part of it. Obviously, they don't know everything about the human body, but they know certain parts of it to be able to get into your body and fix it. How would that happen if there was no certainty? If my heart was on this side and your heart's on this side and somebody else's heart's down here somewhere, it would be very unpredictable and very hard to study, wouldn't it? And you're basically going to be taking your life at a risk every time you go under a scalpel. But most people go into a doctor with a lot of confidence, even if they are getting an operation, that they'll come out of the operation still alive, for the reason that there's certainty in the way where everything in your body is placed, even. So there's certainty everywhere. And one, we need to look at how you determine truth about things you can't see. But we humans have determined truths at the moment about many things they can't see, right? Recently there's been a measurement of small particles, like what they're searching for, like they call the God particle, and they've been searching for small particles. And what they do is they use all this energy and other things, and to create a separation of particles, and then they measure the effects of those particles without seeing them. That's how they know they're there. Does that make sense? So they're measuring things based on certainty, based upon the effects of them, even though they can't see them. So seeing something is not a requirement of truth, right? Because you've got to there's all sorts of ways you can measure something without seeing it. So an example, sound wave. You can measure that you're measuring that right now. I'm speaking, producing a wave, you're hearing it, and that sound is going through space. You can't see it, but you trust it. You know it's there because you're hearing the effect of it. That's an example of certainty of something you cannot see, and yet you believe in it totally. Humans do this all the time. It's the same with light. The things you're actually seeing are actually wavelengths of light. They're actually vibrations that your eye is tuned to pick up in a certain wavelength. You think about those vibrations of light, and the average person doesn't understand that that's what makes colour. And different vibrations of light makes colour. But, you think about 150, 200 years ago when they didn't really know much about that, right? The average person probably gave it no consideration at all, but there's huge amounts of laws that govern how this vibration is measured by your eye and then transmitted to signals in your brain, and you can then interpret those messages and work out that what you're seeing is actually real, because I can go up to you and touch your face because I can see it, and I know exactly how to touch it because I can see it. But all of that is based upon things I can't see being transmitted between you and I. And so there's many things we can't see. Now, obviously, one of those things is God. But that doesn't mean that just because we can't see God, that there isn't examples of the effects of God everywhere.
I suppose, you can have faith based on what you said earlier, because someone teaches you versus actually observing the universe and learning that way. Even if you don't understand, you can question.
Yeah, that's right. And so when it comes to God, for example, frequently humans are making assumptions about God's character. So in the Bible, in the Quran, there are assumptions about God's character that say that God fundamentally is a God of wrath. But if God was a God of wrath, we'd all be dead already. So there's no evidence to support that God is a God of wrath. None at all. right? Even though many people on earth, even those of religion who say they have faith in God's love, they also have faith in God's rage. Is there such a thing as God's rage? Well, we can't see God, but we can certainly see the effects of God. And if God was in a rage, what do you do when you're in a rage? You destroy things. What does an infinite being do when they're in a rage? Destroy everything infinitely, you would say, wouldn't you? Which would include all the creations, of which I'm one. So the fact that I haven't died already means God is not a God of wrath. There's examples of this we can use everywhere, where we can use logic to determine an outcome based on mathematical and scientific certainty of what's gone on. Does that make sense,
Yeah,
Sandra?
it's very, very sobering.
Yeah, so the important thing to understand here is that truth is available to you, and all we've got to do is search for it. All we've got to do is seek it. If we seek it, we will find it, but we've got to seek it. If you think about many times during dark ages of human history, there was a lot of imposition on people not to seek. So if you look at the dark religious ages of from 300 to the sort of like 1200 of the Common Era, you know, we're talking about periods from nearly 2,000 years ago to nearly over 1,000 years ago. In that period, there was a lot of emphasis placed by people in power to force people to not seek. So there was a lot of religious imposition to not seek, and there was a lot of political imposition on humans to not seek. Because if people seek, they find, and if they find, they might realise that the people in power and the people who are forcing these things upon you are actually in error, and then there'd be a rebellion. So the average, you could say authority on earth doesn't like to see rebellion, so they don't want you to seek the truth. God is the opposite to that. He wants you to seek the truth. Right? The universe has been designed for you to seek the truth, and you will be happier doing it. And so this is all about, the truth is very much related to happiness. The more you seek truth, the happier you will be, because you can use that truth to your advantage one way or another. So the more you seek that truth, the more happy you can also become. Just straight on.
Hi, Jesus.
Yeah.
In regards to the truth, so my life seeking truth.
Yep.
But how do I know that what's in front of me with truth is the actual truth? Because there's been times I think, okay, I'm praying,
Yep.
and there's something in front of me or an answer, and then I question it because I feel, well, is this true, or am I going to be deceived?
Yeah, it's a valid question, isn't it? Obviously, just like the seeking of truth, finding the truth is going to be to your benefit. If you get deceived, it's going to be to your detriment, isn't it? So the average person does have a lot of fear associated with the seeking of truth, because they sort of go, well, if I seek a truth, there's a number of emotional responses people have, you could say, to seeking truth. One is, if I seek a truth, then my life has to change, and I don't want it to change. So I don't really want to find out what that truth is, right? So that, you could say, is going to cause you to not seek it. But then there's other people who have sought the truth only to be presented with error. And then over time, that error has been established to their detriment, to their pain and suffering. So you could say, well, that then gives you the feeling that you should fear what people tell you. But my feeling is, no, you shouldn't fear what people tell you. What you should do is seek to know whether that's true or not. Right? You don't have to fear anything you hear. You only need to know whether it's true or not, and then you can discard it if it's false. And then, of course, if you discard the false, it will never cause you pain. Right? If you discard the truth, of course, it will cause you pain. And we'll go through later reasons why that's the case. So my feeling is, always seek the truth. And if you have questions, you keep it on the questions list. You don't make it a truth and then live by it until the questions are resolved. Do you understand? So there's little point in hearing, like, let's say you hear a religious philosophy, and then they tell you, the person who's sharing that with you says, oh, that's true. There's little point in then you going, well, okay, I'm going to believe that's true and act upon it right now. You could go, I don't believe that's true, but I'm going to do an experiment, like a scientist would do, an experiment, knowing that there might be an outcome which is false or positive or negative from that experiment. I could do that, which is the way most humans have found scientific advances. They've experimented and experimented and experimented, and eventually they've arrived at the truth, right? That's how we've advanced scientifically in the last 150 years, pretty much. So, you know, you can do that with everything. It's not just physical things, but emotional things, spiritual things. You could say beliefs. All of those things can be experimented with. But with any experiment, you go into it with the possibility that it will turn out to be false, right? Not going into it with the feeling of certainty before you have any certainty mathematically or scientifically, right? If you look at the past for yourself, you can see that you've gone into certain things with more certainty than they've merited, and then in the end caused you pain, right? And unfortunately that then creates its emotional signature in you, which says, I've got to be careful. So now I can't trust a thing that is actually true, or I can't at least experiment with a thing that's actually true. So you've got to be careful of that. Like, history doesn't determine the truth either. What determines the truth, and is not your emotional history, but rather whether it's true or not. And so if you can't, and you haven't had it proven to you that it's true through experimentation, which will have to be yours, I must say, your experimentation, how are you ever going to know that it is true? That being said, there's many things you currently trust where other people have sought truths and you know they work, even though you haven't sought those truths. And I've given many times an example of a mobile phone. There are so many laws of truth in a mobile phone, of the way things work in a phone. All of you trust them without hardly knowing how they are put together. An electronic engineer might know how they put it together, but most of the normal population do not, and yet they trust the device implicitly, oftentimes far more than it's worthy of being trusted, I must say, right? Given the fact that it's governed by laws that are often breaking, So when I say breaking, that humans are often breaking. So an example of that is you pick up your mobile phone to dial, but there's no signal. So naturally, it's not going to work now, right? And so we call that out of range. But that's an example of the law has been broken with the transmission device in the phone and the reception device where it connects to a network. That law has now been broken, and so now it won't work. So it's not as reliable as it could be until the law is engaged again. In other words, you get close enough to a cell phone tower, and now, of course, it's going to engage again, and you'll be in harmony with the law again. So we experience this kind of thing every day, where we trust a law, and under certain circumstances, the law is our trust of it is broken, but not in the law. The law, we still trust the law. So when you don't have a mobile phone signal, you still trust the law. You say to yourself, oh, the reason why is because I'm not close enough to a tower. You don't say to yourself, oh, God's just arbitrarily determined that I'm not allowed to talk to anybody anymore. Do you understand? There's a law that governs that, and you don't say, oh, all I've got to do is move closer to a tower and I'll get some communication. You know that law exists, and so you do it, you take an action to engage, to make sure you're in harmony with the law's operation. So it's very much the same with our investigation of any truth, including spiritual truth. We must always make sure there is some certainty there. And it's no good emotionally embracing something if there's no certainty. It's a very risky thing to do, in fact, right? You could say on earth most religions are cults because they encourage you to engage certainty without scientific or mathematical knowledge. Now that is a very, very dangerous thing to do. Divine truth doesn't expect that of you. Make sense? What divine truth is God's truth, therefore absolute truth. It engages mathematical certainty. It doesn't expect that you believe in something or trust something that you don't believe in yet. In fact, God knows that unless you believe in it, you are not going to do the thing. Unless you truly believe in it. So God's always providing evidence. If you haven't found the evidence yet, it does not mean that that evidence does not exist. It just means oftentimes that your method of trying to find it is faulty. Right? So remember, it's not dependent upon your knowledge. It's dependent upon you finding or striking upon, you could say, the way to find it. Right? So when it comes to knowledge about physical laws, the easiest way to get that knowledge is to experiment and you'll find it. When it comes to spiritual laws, well, that's a bit different because they're all things you generally cannot see easily. And therefore, there's going to have to be other ways you find it. But it doesn't mean that it's not there. The knowledge isn't there. Does that make sense? Just because a human can't find it.
Thank you, Jesus. Just with the spiritual, what you just said there, can you receive those truths in your awareness or sleep state? Like if I'm asking a question and it's...
You can receive the truth in any state you live.
In any state.
Yeah. Of course, whether you're conscious of it in a different state will depend on other laws, right? In terms of how you're engaging those laws. So let's say so most people that I talk to are now aware that you have a sleep state, right? For, when you're asleep, that you're still alive and you're doing things and learning things. But why is it I don't remember most of it? Well, that's because of the laws that I'm breaking in my awake state, which prevent me from remembering. If I didn't break those laws, then I would remember. The key then is finding out what laws. And then once I know the laws that I'm breaking, I'll remember. I'll remember everything I did while I was asleep. Of course, your human body might not be that rested after that period. So that's something to consider in that process, obviously. Because the whole purpose of sleep on earth is to rest the body for a period to gain energy back. But that's a part of that law, So you may choose to not remember certain things you do in your sleep state for the sake of your physical body's recovery. Right? But again, it's using the law to your advantage if you know it. That's the key point. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
All right, so these laws govern the smallest thing, the smallest particles, the infinitely small particles God has created, which are far smaller than what humans imagine, up to the largest of God's creation in terms of the most complex of God's creations, which is the human soul. These laws govern everything. They govern how everything works, how everything functions, the interrelationship between everything, the symbiotic relationship between everything. They're all governed by the same laws. Now, of course, the laws, you could say, have a hierarchy, and we need to go a bit more into that hierarchy, because in the coming discussion, when I talk about humans, obviously there's certain laws that apply to humans that are different to the laws that apply to animals and different to the laws that apply to inanimate things, right? And so there's a special class of laws, you could say, that apply to the human soul. And it's important for us to sort of understand you could say, the hierarchy of laws to some degree. Now, of course, the hierarchy of laws is very complicated. Naturally, with an infinite universe, you're going to have a complicated relationship between many, many millions of laws at any one particular point of time. So inside of your body, for example, your physical body I'm talking about now, there are literally millions of laws governing the operations of your body at any one point in time. So obviously, how much of that you understand is going to depend upon how much you've learned, how much you've educated yourself, and how that education has been received. If the education has been received by people who don't know, then a lot of what you've learned will be just suppositions and things you don't really know. If the education is received by people who know, then a lot of that then becomes dependent upon whether you're able to understand what they know. And once you are, then of course you can do something about that. So the same principle applies with our seeking. We will only know when we seek. And for many of us, we're not seeking because we don't even think the law is important enough for us to know. So an example of that is your instinctual function. So as soon as you're born, pretty much, your instinctual function is to breathe. Right? In the womb, you didn't breathe, but as soon as you met the air, your instinctual function was to breathe, the lungs to work. Now, most of you didn't know at the time you started breathing that was the instinctual function you had. And even now, many of you probably haven't thought about it, that was an instinctual function. But it is. Without it, you would have died. The physical body would have died, I would say, rather than you dying. But your physical body would have died if you didn't breathe. You need oxygen in the physical body to sustain it. That's one of the laws. There is a certain mixture of oxygen that you need to sustain your physical body. That's one of the laws too. Right? Your lungs function by utilizing the oxygen in the atmosphere and converting that oxygen into energy, right? So your lungs had to function based instinctually upon what it's created to function like. And you didn't determine that. You didn't decide upon that. You didn't make a decision about that. You just did it. And that's an example of an instinctual function. Then, of course, there's other functions that you have that are not instinctual, but you learn them over time. And so we need to talk about these things in terms of learning. So we're right with this so far. We're going to the hierarchy now. So we just want to move into the hierarchy of law. And the reason why this is important is the hierarchy of law will determine much of your happiness. If you understand that there's lower laws, and we'll do them from the lower laws to the higher ones in this case. So if we start off with the physical laws, you could say they are really physical truths. Now, most of you are pretty comfortable with many of these things. In other words, you're comfortable with the truth of these things. So an example of that is the example I just gave about gravity. You're comfortable with it, right? If you went even to another planet that had double the size of Earth, in terms of that had double the gravitational pull of Earth, you'd be pretty uncomfortable with it. Because you've been used to being comfortable on this Earth, and then you're going to a new one where there's still the same law, but because of the mass of the planet you're now on, it's having twice the effect, and you'd weigh twice as much. Now, you would instantly go from, in my case, I weigh about 80 kilograms. I'd instantly go from weighing 80 kilograms to 160 kilograms. Now, you imagine that. Mm-hmm. That'd be pretty hard on you, wouldn't it? On your joints and your body and your muscles and your lethargy, your tiredness would come into play as well, how long you could endure that atmosphere for. But so in that case, you'd be pretty uncomfortable with the law, but you still know what's causing it, because you know the law of gravity causes these things, right? So they are physical truths, and they are truths no matter where you are in the universe, right? Unless there is a higher law in the physical state, there is a higher law that allows me to overcome it. So, for example, there are laws that humans have yet to discover on Earth relating to teleportation, for example, the movement of matter from one place to another using different portals that exist in the spirit form. Now, those laws exist, but no humans know how to use them. And so, even though they exist, it's like to us they're not there. But they are there. It's just nobody's using them. Nobody understands them, so they can't use them. It's only by understanding that you can come to use them. So with any physical law, you've got to learn about it, just like you would learn about anything else, and that's a process of education. So the key is to enjoy your education, because it's something you'll be doing for the rest of your existence. Many of us want our education to stop. You know, we have a period of time where we go to school, then we go maybe to university if we're unlucky, and then by the end of, I don't know what you felt about university, but I thought I was pretty unlucky going there. And you know, and then after that you go, I want to be over this, right? I want to get on with life. But what we're not realising, of course, is that life is governed by our education, so we still need to educate ourselves, right? And education is all about finding out about the laws. Because if I find out about the laws, I'll be happy. If I don't find out about the laws, I won't be able to use them. And potentially I might try to break them, and that will cause disease and unhappiness. So that would be bad. I don't want that. I want to be happy and I want to be disease-free. So in my engagement of these laws, it makes sense for me to seek them. The next layer of laws are the laws that govern. So these are all governing things, and then there's laws that govern sexuality. So you could say they are truths about the sexual process. Now, of course, humans aren't the only thing involved in the sexual process, are they? You've got animals that have a sexual process. Many creatures, right down to even cells, have certain sexual processes going on in them. So this is a universal series of laws that doesn't just govern humans. It governs all sorts of creatures that have been designed. But these laws govern the interrelationship between the male and the female, you could say. How that works, how procreation works, for example, and all of those kind of things. There's truths associated with all of that. So you could say, in a way, they're a flavour of physical laws, because they still govern physical functioning. But they are beyond physical, because they also include areas where you no longer have a physical body. And so they're beyond physical in their governance, right? The physical laws govern physical things, and also, I must say, the physical things appear in three areas, because they appear in, you could say, three different universes. There's three different universes, which I should mention. There's the soul universe, there's the spirit universe, and then there's the physical universe in which we're present right now. And actually, we're present in all three at the same time. Right? The human is present in all three at the same time, but lacking in awareness of its presence in all of those areas. So you could say the physical laws apply to every part of this universe. So these are parts of the universe that govern certain areas. Some of them govern things pertaining to all matter, and some of them govern things pertaining to the soul itself and how that works. But functionally, basically, physical laws govern all of those things, and they govern the operation of all of those things. Sexual laws also govern the operation of all of those things. So you have laws that are governing your sexual nature, as well as laws that govern the happiness that results from your sexual behaviour. And there are different kinds of laws, because the sexual laws also are subservient to. Remember, we're going down, but we're actually going up in the hierarchy to the emotional laws. So there's things that you might engage that sexually that cause you to feel things emotionally. And of course, there's a whole series of laws that are governing there. Now, of course, one of the ways you're measuring all of these laws is through your senses. Now, and this is another hierarchy, because in your body, your physical body, you have senses, but then in your spirit body, we'll talk about that in a minute, you have other senses, and in your soul you have other senses. So, and these senses are supersets of each other. So we will talk about this more in a minute, but you can see that this is one way you're measuring the effects of the truth, measuring the effects of the law. Right? You do something and it feels bad sensorially. So in other words, you get a knife and you cut your skin, it's because of the laws governing your body and the sensory apparatus of your nervous system, you're going to have some pain, right? And the pain's saying, don't do that. You do that too much, you're going to die, right? So the pain is a receptor saying, don't do things like that to yourself, right? So you're going to be happy if you don't do it, but if you start doing it all the time, you're going to be pretty unhappy all the time. So a person who self-flagellates, punishes themselves all the time physically, is going to be unhappy. In fact, they have to be unhappy even to do it, right? Because there's too much pain, right, in it. Otherwise, obviously there's some other pain that they have which is higher in the hierarchy, such as their emotional pain, which allows them to do the thing that's destructive to their physical body. So you can see, if I'm feeling something emotionally, it's going to overcome my logic physically and sexually, right? So this is why people have sexual relationships with people that are bad to have sexual relationships with, right? Because emotionally there's something that drives them to it, right? But that is now going to cause them physical and sexual problems, as well as emotional problems, obviously, because of the hierarchy, right? And then we've got, you could say, spiritual, which is the highest of the hierarchy. But let's define spiritual. It's not some sort of mumbo-jumbo type thing. It's to do with love and truth, specifically. So it's to do with belief systems. So when somebody asks you, are you a spiritual person? Well, everybody is a spiritual person, whether you like it or not. You have been designed to be governed by spiritual laws, and actually you have instinctual things spiritually as well as will-based things that happen inside of you with regard to spiritual laws. So all persons are a spiritual person. I don't mean you're a spirit like shape or being. I mean you're a spiritual person in the sense that there's spiritual laws governing you, and there's spiritual instinctual things that are going on inside of you which govern you. And one of those things you could say is your will. Another one of those things is your self-awareness. They are spiritual things. Humans are the only self-aware being, and that is a spiritual facility, a faculty inbuilt in your soul. So we're all spiritual beings. So it doesn't make any sense to me when somebody asks that question, are you a spiritual person? Because we all are, right? Just like we're all emotional persons and we're all sexual persons and we're all physical persons, because we're governed by laws that govern every one of those areas. So naturally we are. So when it comes to finding out about the soul, so the reason why we're having this discussion is it's a precursor, isn't it, to discovery about the human. Like, if we're going to discuss human life and what happens after death, we have to know certain parts of the laws that govern the functions or faculties of these particular parts of the human in order to understand what happens when these events happen, right? And this is a part of our understanding needs to be this. Now, of course, we could spend, literally, I've spent nearly 2,000 years, a bit more, trying to discover laws. You could spend a lot of time on it. Yep. My feeling is it's time worth spending because it brings you happiness if you spend the time on it. The average person on earth doesn't spend hardly any time on it at all, to their own detriment. And then when they arrive in the next life, they start spending a bit of time on it because they realise they have to. There was a whole series of things that they didn't know about the spirit life to do with all the laws in all the 4 areas of hierarchy that they didn't know about the spirit life, and it's to their own detriment. So not only is it important for us to learn about this life, but it's also important to learn about what happens after we die, after we get out of this life. That's important to learn about as well. Is there any questions about that? Let me have a cough. clear?
I want to ask, like, what, when you say be curious about the laws, is it like how things work? Is that what it is really?
Well, you could say it's broken up into a number of different areas if we want to look at it scientifically. It's not just about how things work, because when you examine anything, so example, here's a pen, a whiteboard marker it's called. So here's my whiteboard marker. How does it work is only one aspect of it, isn't it?
So how it's designed as well?
Yeah, there's also how it's designed, what it looks like, what does it sound like. You know, there's a lot of other, you could say, attributes or qualities about the marker that I could learn about. How was it designed? How does it get the ink to the tip? You know, there's all these, you know, there's capillary reactions that govern its operation, that are, you know, a law actually that governs its operation. What laws govern the operation of the marker? What laws govern its creation? What laws govern its discard, you know, like getting rid of it as rubbish? What laws govern that? It's not just about how it works. You can see how it works is only one aspect of the thing. Can you see that? There's all these other things that are a part of understanding it. How it looks, how it feels, what it sounds like, what it does. But there's also how it was designed, the materials that went into it, the substances that are, the laws that govern the operation of those substances, where they came from. One thing. And it's a highly complex thing. We think of it as a very basic part of humanity now, but 200 years ago they never had them because they didn't understand the laws involved in creating one. I find them really handy. I can write some things on a board and rub it off. That's a fantastic thing. Right? I don't need a piece of tech to do it. I just need a board and a pen. Right? Wonderful. But it is a piece of tech, isn't it? There's all this technology that's gone into it. If you think about it, you could spend 10 years or more. In fact, if you look at all the laws that were created, that people had to discover in order to make one, they spent more than 100 years finding those laws to make one. And a lot of this come about by accident. They discovered one thing, like capillary reaction, for example, and then they realized it could apply to coloured things as well as to water. And then they had to understand dyes, how those are made, what colours go into those dyes. When you think about it, it's a highly complex piece of machinery, right? And I must say, highly complex machines are used to create it, right? So there's a lot of things, just for that one simple thing, there's a lot of things that had to be done to discover the laws about the thing. And it wasn't just about how it operates. Of course, how it operates was a part of its design, because it needed to be a simple thing, you know, where I could just take off a lid. And why has it got a lid? Because it's so annoying. There's a clicking all the time. I put the lid on. It's in the sound all the time. Sometimes I get it out. It's annoying. Right. There's a lid. You want to interrupt me, Ben?
No. I just went to the loo and then I heard there's something wrong with the sound.
No, so I'm just talking about the lid. But there's a lid. Why is there a lid? Because the way the ink works, it can dry out and then make the whole thing useless, so there has to be one, isn't it? Right, so part of its design have a lid, but it had to have a lid that you could remove so you could write. So that's why it's got two parts, right? There's actually more than two parts, because you can actually take it all apart with these ones, the reason why we bought these ones, and refill them up with ink, so I don't have to chuck away the marker, right? So we've got enough whiteboard ink, probably lasts me 100 years, I reckon. Till I come up with some other way of trying to transfer information from my mind to yours. And you think about the complexity of that machine, that one machine, and how many laws had to be discovered just to make it. It's incredible, really. And this is why they didn't have them 200 years ago, because there was so many laws they had to discover which humans at that time had not discovered yet. So they couldn't make it. And only by the discovering of those laws could they make it. In the first century, I used to draw in the sand. So I used to do a lot of diagrams within the sand, but the trouble with doing it in the sand, it's like you do it in the sand and then everybody would have to swap over looking at it and examining the diagram and so forth. It took a lot of time, right? Because we didn't have the tech. And we only have the tech because we understand the laws that govern the tech. So this is the thing to remember. It's very good for us to know the laws. Yeah? But
I'm a person who's not good at studying and things like that, so it's doing my head in thinking about having to learn, you know, all the intricacies of everything. Like, so
you don't have to learn.
Yes. So I'm thinking then, okay, so
You can
we
be
kept it more.
stupid for the rest of your life.
Thank you.
if that's what you want.
No.
It does
But,
make a lot of sense, of course.
No, but so it made me reflect on that. If I just got out of my head and got more emotional, then the learning would be easier.
Well, when it comes to truth, we need to discuss how to learn, don't we? Because that's the next thing I wanted to discuss, how to learn. A lot of people on earth feel that every bit of learning is intellectual. It's all about the mind, using the mind to learn, understanding the thing with the mind, trying to do it based on your mind's understanding, those kind of things. But actually using your mind to learn is one of the slowest forms of learning.
And exhausting.
And exhausting, yeah, often it is exhausting. Of course, your mind is a tool, just like all the other tools you have at your disposal. Your mind is one that needs to be engaged in order to learn. So your mind is a machine that is only able to respond to its inputs. There's also two parts of your mind. There's the instinctual part, which is your brain, the way it physically functions. And then there's your mind, which is what you do with your belief systems based upon how your brain physically functions. So you've got your physical functioning of the brain, and then you've got your mind behind that brain, which is in your spirit body. And that mind, of course, functions a certain way too. And how a memory is stored. We need to understand where they're stored, how they're stored. They're not even stored in your spirit body's mind or your physical body's brain. And that's why a person can destroy a part of their brain and recover their memories. Because their memories are not in their brain. They're not actually in their brain at all. They're in their soul. So there's connection points we need to understand between the three parts of the human, which we'll go into in a minute. But we do need to discuss how you go about finding truth. Because your brain, or you could say your intellect, is only a very limited tool to find truth. Yep. You imagine if you just had a brain but you had no senses.
Oh. I'd be a computer.
That's right. And how much truth do computers discover? Hardly any, right? All they do is they get, and this is what they're doing lately, isn't it? They're getting all the information of the world that's already there through other means, and they're collecting it all together and calling it artificial intelligence. Right? But it fundamentally is a very flawed thing to do, is to get all the information available and then based upon that information make assumptions. That's very dangerous thing to do for us. You wouldn't want to do that if you were discovering truth. Right? So that's not the way your intellect is. If it was removed from all of your senses, your intellect would be a very inefficient way of discovering truth, if you think about it. So yes, we need to look at ways to discover truth, don't we? And your intellect is one way, but a very, very functionally limited way. Because if you removed, for example, the sensory apparatus that you have, your intellect would be operating in a vacuum of information. The only way it gets information is through the senses. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. So how does the intellect get information? It first has to have sensory inputs that it's measuring. So one of them is your hearing. It has to hear something to process it, right? It has to see something. So that's your eyesight. That's an important part of the sensory information that you need for your intellect to actually function. It has to touch something, usually. Or you could say feel something. Right? It has to taste something. Or smell something. Right? It's got to do things. It's got to have, you could say there's got to be devices connected to this brain. You understand? And this is a functional thing that a lot of people don't consider. But for your intellect to actually function, it needs all these sensory apparatus working for your intellect to function. And without that functioning, without this measurement, so if you had no eyesight, no hearing, no touch, no feelings, and if those were the only senses you had, which I must say they are not, but if they were, the brain would be in a vacuum. And so what can it do? The answer would be nothing. It couldn't understand anything. Right? So it needs things. So the intellect is a very inefficient thing by itself. It needs things. It needs senses. Firstly. So it needs the senses in order to function. Right? So you're not going to be able to find out truth just using your mind. You have to use your senses. You have to see things, hear things, touch things, taste things, smell things. At least that to discover truths about the things. So an example of that, if I had an apple and I put the apple next to a brain but it wasn't connected to any senses. What can it tell me about the apple? Nothing at all. Nothing at all is the answer, right? It needs the sight, the sense of hearing, the sense of taste, the sense of touch, the sense of smell. It needs those senses in order to determine the truth about the apple. Does that make sense? So the intellect, while it can be used as a tool to discover truth, it's a very inefficient tool without other things working, without other senses working. The intellect itself in fact, the intellect itself would not even be a tool where it could even function. So it's sort of like any device that people make now, like in your car. You know, they're introducing self-driving cars, right? How does that work? Well, because the brain of the car has sensors. It has, optical sensors to measure distances all around the car. And as soon as you block those sensors, the car doesn't work.
Mine shuts down all the time.
That's right. All the new cars are very unreliable for that reason, aren't they? Because it just needs a sensor to fail, and bang, the whole brain fails and nothing works. So that's an example of the intelligence needing sensory apparatus to function, to determine the truth of a thing. Right? It's the same with your body. So senses, your intellect, yes, is a way of determining truth, but a very inefficient way by itself. Once it's married to or joined to the senses, and those senses are functioning appropriately, they have to be working. Now your intellect is able to process information that makes sense to it. So, and it's using the senses of in this case, just the body, you could say, but it's not just the body. We'll talk about that later when we talk about how the human is made. But it's using these senses to assimilate information. So you need to use your senses to assimilate information, right? In the case of the human, there's other things, apparatus, you could call it, that you have that help you determine things. So emotion is another apparatus. Very powerful apparatus. In fact, you are far more governed by your emotions than you are by your intellect, if you think about your life. If you took away your emotions, what would your life feel like? It'd be weird, wouldn't it?
Bland.
Like if you think about it. The emotions are what makes your life happy or unhappy or painful or pleasurable, or You know, without them, how would you know or feel what's going on at any one point in time? You need the emotions. And the emotions don't belong to the mind and to the intellect. Right? So a little baby who has an undeveloped mind still has feelings. They cry when they're sad or distressed. They smile when they're happy. Right? They have feelings, but their mind's hardly processing any of it. Right? Their mind's not the determinator, you could say, the thing that determines their feelings. Right? The emotion does. Once you marry your emotions with your senses, that's where a lot of joy in life is. If you only marry your intellect with your senses, you can determine things, but the joy of life is missing. Right? Once the emotions are involved, now I can enjoy my life. Right? I can use my senses to the happiness of myself. You know, so to improve my own happiness, right? So the emotional part of me is very, very important. But interestingly, it's not the only thing that drives me. There's another section of truth we need to understand, and that's sorting out our beliefs. Because they drive me to do the emotional thing. And to marry my senses with my emotions and to join all that together and enjoy it and to enjoy life in that regard.
Is this a hierarchy going down again?
Exactly. In a lot of ways you can see, can't you? Minimum, extra, extra, extra. These are all ways to determine truths, right? So you could call these the senses. So I'll put all of this together and call that the senses that you could use to determine truths. But that's not the only way to determine the truth. But you need them to determine the truth, don't you? You need to have these things in order to determine truth. But it's not the only way to determine the truth, because you can experiment with things outside of yourself to determine truth. So in addition to these things, you need to experiment to determine truth. And that's using things outside of yourself and then using the senses that are inside of yourself in a harmonious manner to determine what the truth is about a thing. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's what an experiment is. You need to experiment. The only way, without being told something, the only way to discover that thing is to experiment. Right? But of course, it'd be better if you could just be informed by somebody else. Or you could say, let's call it what it really is, educated by somebody who knows. Does that make sense? That is more powerful than an experiment. Because an experiment, you might have to, just to determine one truth, like to determine the truth of gravity and to determine the speed of gravity and all the other functions of gravity, not all of them, but just a minor amount of the functions of gravity. When Newton did his experiments, it took him years. The next person who came along, he just told them. And they didn't have to take years. Does that make sense? So having an education is going to be better than having an experiment. Does that make sense? You can experiment and it's very powerful, but you need to also have an education.
So that's another hierarchy there.
That's another hierarchy. So you can see hierarchies in the determining of truth. Hierarchies are present all the time. You can use higher forms of like ways of finding information, or you can use the lower one. That's your choice. You have a choice to make about. With this one, you don't have to trust anyone but yourself, but you do have to trust your senses. And you do have to trust your feelings and beliefs and your intellect. Right? You've got to trust something in order for it to even work. Right? This one, you can trust somebody else, but that means the emotion of not trusting somebody else has to go. Right? So if you have an emotion of not trusting someone else when it comes to education, you're going to be pretty stuffed. Right? Because at some point, if you want to get educated about things you don't know, the fastest way to do that is to trust somebody who knows. Right? And this is a functional problem that we have when we come to determine spiritual truths. The average person on earth does not know what they're sharing is true, and so you're listening and getting educated, but the education's turning out to be false. And so all that's going to do is be to your detriment, because remember we said that anything that's harmonious with truth is to your betterment, but anything disharmonious with truth is to your detriment. Right? So if you have an emotion where you can't trust somebody who's already educated and you can't determine, because there's plenty of people on earth who think they're educated, but they're not. There's, you go up to the average man, girls, and ask them about a mechanical device, and they always think they know more than you, right? Whether they do or not. Whether they've been educated by reading the book or not. They always think they know better, right? Well, that's an emotion. Right? An emotion determining who they're going to trust, right? And if you're in a state where you have these emotions, obviously your education is going to have detrimental effects, because you're going to trust the people who are untrustworthy and then not trust the people who are trustworthy. Right? At the moment, there's many people on earth claiming to be Jesus. And one of them might be. Right? But how are you going to know? It's the same principle, right? You firstly look at inside yourself. Are there reasons why I don't want to trust anybody who says they're Jesus? Well, the average person has a list of emotions there, right? But then, of course, they also have a list of feelings associated with whether they can trust anybody at all, external to themselves. So you'd have to deal with that. But then you'd have to use your senses, your emotions, your beliefs, your experiments, the ways you're using to determine truth, whether to determine that one of those so-called Jesus people is the actual Jesus person or not. You'd have to do that, wouldn't you? If you were logical about it, that's what you would do. It's the same principle. You don't have to be afraid of any of them. You don't have to be afraid of listening to them, because you're only going to be afraid of listening to them if you actually listen to them and do what they say without experimenting. Right? And that wouldn't be a very wise thing to do at all. You need to have your own experimental process in order to come to the knowledge, you could say, of the truth, whatever that truth is. Pardon?
Just on that then, on the last hierarchy, senses, experiment, educate, then a fourth one would not be education from the higher source.
Okay, so there's sources of education, isn't there, that we can start listing in the hierarchy?
Yeah.
There's obviously self-education.
Yeah.
Pretty limited, isn't it? Because you're only based on what you already know,
Very narrow.
and so it's going to be based on what you already know. Unfortunately, a person who's arrogant prefers that, but it's not going to help you very much because it's only based on what you know, right? Then there's education from a source who claims to know. Now, they might know, right? But how do you know they know? You're going to have to check their claims and so forth, aren't you? You're going to have to put some effort in it. Yeah. Then there's a person who, there's a hierarchy of people, isn't there, in here? You in a physical sense, you could go, right, I can learn a trade, I can then learn a PhD, I can get a university degree. So these are hierarchies of knowledge that have been arbitrarily established by humans. Not very good, because many of them are based upon the humans that have come before them and what they knew. And as you know, many of you have gone to courses, right, in university, and frequently they get you to regurgitate what other people discovered, right, without you necessarily knowing. And in fact, if you want to get a university degree very quickly, all you have to do is just regurgitate the info. Just like you had to do at school, right? You didn't have to know maths, you just had to regurgitate the maths. You didn't have to know English, you just had to regurgitate it, right? So even that is a flawed method, because there's a difference between knowing and just regurgitating information. Like, any person can regurgitate information given a clear enough memory, right? But it doesn't mean you know something. So there's a higher hierarchy here, and you could say the top of that hierarchy is the creator of all these things. If there is such a creator, that would be the top of the hierarchy. If such a creator exists, it would make sense that I listen to them first. If they don't exist, well, find the next person who does know those things. It's pretty hard, isn't it? I don't know what you've found on Earth, but like just last week I was looking at floorboards. Finding someone who knows is really hard, because they usually have a very, very specific range of information they do know, and then beyond that information they don't know. So like I was asking a concrete guy about putting concrete on top of AAC, which is another type of aerated concrete. He's been in the business for 70 years or 60 years, 60 years, I think he said. He didn't know, right? He's never done it. How can he know? How can he know what the problems are if he hasn't done the experiment? So this is a problem. Unless we do the experiments, we really can't come to know either. So the reason why I've said all this is really important, and that is for you to come to know truth about you, you are going to have to go through all of these methods of coming to understand how you can come to know. You're not going to be able to discover it any other way. There's people you can trust, but then there's many people who claim you can trust them that you can't trust. So you're going to have to be responsible for the decisions and choices you make. You can't just rely on somebody who says you can trust me. You have to go through the process of determining through experimentation whether you can trust them before you listen to them. What's the point of listening to somebody you can't trust? So all of this is important in coming to know the truth. Remember, I said the truth is absolute. There is a truth on every possible subject you could ask anything about. There is a truth. There's an infinite number of subjects you could ask about, and at the end of the day, every one of them has an absolute truth. But the person who needs to determine that is you. You can't rely on some like leader coming along telling you a truth and you go, right, that sounds good, I'm going to go with that. You can't do that. It's very dangerous for you to do that. You need to determine for yourself whether the thing is a truth or not. So the things that I'm going to share with you about the human soul and about life after death, I have determined for myself to be the truth. And I've done it through experiencing it, not through any guesses or imagination or philosophy, or I've actually gone through an experience to determine that truth. Okay.
Hi, Jesus, I'm Rebecca.
Yep.
I only have an observation to make, and I just want to say that I can understand how it would take you 2,000 years to even touch on all this, because it's so overwhelming and there's so many things to find the truth out about. So that's all I wanted to say. I'm just like feeling how massive that is. Yeah. And that I just have gratitude towards you for doing all that and then coming back and sharing it with us.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. But
I just know how.
Even though I've done it for myself, even me talking about it is not going to be good enough for you.
Yeah.
You understand?
Yes, I do.
It's going to have to be something you do for yourself. Yeah. And this is what you're not going to be able to have a personal experience of the truth until you've absorbed it for yourself. So yes, it is very good that somebody has gone before you. Like, I'm very happy coming to the earth in this time. I'm very happy that the Wright brothers sorted out their flying machine. Because I get to go around the earth talking to people about things, right? So I'm quite happy about that. They did a great job. I'm so happy I can use that information. And that other people come behind them with a lot of engineering techniques and everything. So, you know, their very first plane wouldn't have been very good for me, because it would only fly about, 200 or 300 feet at the most. Eventually it flew longer than that. But you know, I would still have taken months and months and months to get to another country. But because of all the engineering advancements made on that fundamental discovery that other people determined other truths about, I can now fly in a jet, like in an atmosphere that I would normally die in, like 40,000 feet above the earth. I'd normally die there, right? In a few minutes generally. So I can fly in an atmosphere of that high and fly distances, like our longest flight is from here or Perth to London, almost halfway around the world. Like, man, that required a lot of people coming before us, didn't it? To work out information. So I'm one of many millions of people who has worked out things through experiment. The only difference between what I've worked out and what other people worked out is I've had a God focus, and most other people have not.
And the God focus makes it quicker, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yep. And we can talk about that later when we talk about progression. But it's really important to understand that basically all of us have been scientists looking for mathematical truth. And that's all I've done. I'm not looking for some philosophical, religious truth that has no bearing on reality or mathematical or scientific fact. I'm looking for the facts of life. What are the facts of life? And that's what I suggest you do. And I also suggest whatever impediments you have towards doing that, deal with them. Because if you do that, it'll bring you happiness. Right? So you need to deal with the impediments you have towards seeking that truth as well. You can rely on others who have come before you, and that's not a bad thing to do. But you've got to make sure that that information you're getting from those people is reliable. Yeah, very important. Yeah. Any other questions about these matters? Louisa?
Just to clarify, when you're talking about maths and science, and I think you just said it, but you're really just looking for the facts of life, like the nuts and bolts of the truth, or the nuts and bolts, because I've got a block to science and maths, and when we talk about
Just hang a sec though. You're not just looking for the facts, you're looking for, to be searching for truth, you're searching for how it feels, as well as the fact. Like, it's not just a fact, but it's also the fact of how that makes you feel. It's the fact of what that causes you to believe. It's the fact of how that makes you feel sexually, emotionally, spiritually. It's the fact of how it makes you feel physically. There's not just a fact on the intellect side, you understand?
So, and that's all maths.
They're all facts.
Yeah.
So there's a common misconception on earth, I feel, at the moment, that you only have mathematical facts.
Yeah.
But no, you don't. You have mathematical facts that impact upon every area of your life in all these different areas that bring other feelings to the table about those things. So there's emotional facts, there's spiritual facts, there's, sexual facts. They are all governed mathematically and scientifically. In other words, if you engage certain ways sexually, I can guarantee you will get a disease from that.
Yeah.
That's a fact.
Yes.
You understand?
Yes.
There's certain things you can do with your body, for example, that will cause it to enter into a state of disease if you engage those particular things. They are facts. They happen to everybody who does that. Do you understand? Everybody who has a certain combination of emotions with a certain combination of behavioural actions will end up with a certain combination of diseases, because the law says that it's not just the fact of the intellect of it, but it's actually involving all of these sensory apparatus of your body itself, your mind, your feelings, your emotions, what I classify as the senses of your soul, are all engaged in this process of gathering fact.
And that's would it be true to say that that's true science? At the moment,
Yeah.
it's like that's where I think I'm getting hung up, is it's like in our world, maths and science seems to be like an intellectual process where you miss all of this stuff.
That's the error.
Right.
That's the error.
And so to be a true scientist, this
It's
is the
got to
true
encompass-
scientist. It's got to encompass every part, and then there's a mathematical scientific fact to every part of that.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
So those of you who think, but you're talking about maths now, and I'm not going to cope with that.
Yeah.
Well, no, you've got all these senses that you're going to involved in this process. It's not just your intellect. Remember, we said earlier, the intellect is the most rudimentary, and also without the senses, I said it was the most ineffective and dumb. It can't work. It can't work without them, right? So do you understand? So many of you do not realise, but you actually have developed certain mathematical processes in your soul, in your feelings, in your emotions, and your sexual desires that have overcome your limitations in your intellect. And you can still determine truth using that. Does that make sense? Now, of course, your intellect should not be limited. So that's an issue we need to address, but it's not the only thing that you can use to determine facts. Yeah. So I can in my mind think this is a flaw, but unless I can feel it, touch it, smell it, and use whatever other senses I have to determine what it is, I won't know it is that for certain. Do you understand? So your intellect is a little tool really that can pique your interest so that you do further examination with the other senses you have. Does that make sense to you, Louisa?
Yeah.
So don't get hung up on the idea that, now I'm going to have to use my intellect even more, right? And become so mind or intellectually dominant that actually I can't hardly understand anything at all, which would be the result of that action, which is the reason why humans are very stupid when it comes to emotions and feelings and sexual behaviour and beliefs. You know, we invent the craziest of beliefs. Like, literally. Like, who conjured up the fact that the earth is flat? Like, we invent the craziest of beliefs and yet use our mind to justify that belief without going through all of the other parts of our senses to determine the fact. Right? This has happened over and over and over again in the human race. So we can't do this if we want to determine truth. So when it comes to determining the truth about, how the human works and what happens after you die and all these other things, you can't just use your mind to determine that. There's got to be things you do as experiments that include the other senses you have to determine the truth of the thing. Makes sense?
Yeah.
So those of you who are worried that you weren't very good at maths, when you're at school, and I understand that many of you feel that way. With me, it was sort of the opposite. I wasn't very good at English, as you can tell, right? So I had some emotional blocks to it. Getting my hands wrapped every time I went to write was one of them. But it's like you can see that there can be emotional reasons that would prevent you to demonstrate an interest in a thing. And you need to deal with those things, of course, because all you're doing is limiting one of the senses by not dealing with it, right? So you still need to deal with it, but don't think that that's the only thing at your disposal to determine a truth, because it's not.
And is this why, because God's already been proven scientifically, hasn't it? But it's again, because the scientists are not, this is from what I understand intellectually, about this the proving.
Mhm.
But it seems to me that then scientists are dismissing it because they're not actually going through their own process of using all of their senses to discover or to actually prove that to themselves. It's
Correct.
almost like they want to dismiss, like you were saying, you don't just like see that it might be, your belief might be false before going it. They're already decided that it's false before going ahead.
That's right. Yeah, most scientists have decided emotionally, ironically, because they don't honour the emotions as a method of determining truth. They've decided emotionally that it cannot be true before they've experimented. And this is a very, very silly thing to do. Because fundamentally what you're doing is cutting off one of the means of discovering facts, which is your emotions. They are a means of discovering facts. So when you cut off a means of discovering facts like emotions or senses, and you cut them off, you're crippling yourself for the discovery of truth, right? Which is not a very advisable thing to do.
No, it's exactly what you've just said to me. I've got emotions about maths itself. That's crippling me in one sense. They're just cutting off the emotional part, so that's crippling them in a sense.
Well, it's crippling your intellect,
Yeah.
which is the least amount of the problem, given that it's the least amount of the power of determining truth. And this is how you can arrive at truth without needing your intellect very much. You can still arrive at truths, right? So one of the truths you've arrived at is that emotions are very important.
Yeah.
You've arrived at that truth without the need of your intellect to understand it, haven't you?
Yeah.
It'd be good if your intellect did understand it because it'll help you understand more.
Yeah.
But obviously not a lot more, given the fact that emotions are emotions and the intellect is less powerful. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
I've just got a question about the whole determining truth thing.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure in the sense of, you know, for example, you mentioned earlier about teleportation.
Yep.
How it's possible.
Yep.
Can you, if you, let's say you want to discover that,
Yep.
can you long and develop the passion to ask God about that? Or do you have to kind of prep yourself in a way by going through experiments or understanding other laws?
It's a good question, Nicky. Yep.
Yeah.
So let's look at this. So you understand the senses are involved. There's also a staging that needs to occur. You need to understand certain things before you can understand other things. You understand? Know what I
Makes
mean?
sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it? So if an example, if you had to design a vehicle, there's a whole series of things you'd have to understand first, wouldn't there? You'd have to understand some metallurgy, because you'd have to understand what are you going to make the vehicle out of, right? You'd have to understand materials and how they work and how they function and their limits. You'd have to have some engineering understanding of mathematics in terms of putting the materials together in such a way that makes them strong enough to carry an engine or or electronics or electrical power, whatever. You've got to have an understanding there. You're going to have a foundation, you could say, in lots of different areas of knowledge. That makes sense?
Yep.
Well, one of the things you need a foundation with to understand teleportation is emotion. The average person on Earth has no understanding of any of that. So naturally they can't teleport.
So how the understanding that emotion affect your ability to teleport? Let's say,
How does it?
yeah, how.
Well, if I explain that to you, then you'd have to understand a whole heap of other things for my explanation to make any sense to you.
Yeah.
Do you understand? So what I'm saying though is you're not going to understand how teleportation work unless you understand your emotions first.
Okay.
And because you don't understand your emotions first, how can I explain teleportation to you without you understanding your emotions first? All I can do is present it as an intellectual concept, but it'll just go way over your head and be a waste of time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Until you have some concept emotionally of what's involved, you're not going to get it. You also, to teleport, you have to have some understanding of how love and energy works. Now, the average person on Earth has a very distorted understanding of love because they think addiction is love. And they have a very distorted understanding of energy because they don't understand that energy isn't just, I'm not just talking about power, like electrical power energy. I'm talking about the energy that your soul generates through its functioning. You have to understand how your soul works in order to use it to some degree. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If I can't demonstrate to you how your soul works on a very rudimentary level, how am I going to share how to do it to teleport? Can you see that would be very difficult to do?
Yeah.
So it's impossible to describe to somebody how something works unless they have a foundation. This is why we have an education on earth. This is why people come up with the idea you go to school. Because they thought, we need to educate people in different areas of life, and we need to educate them in particular areas of science, mathematics, and just give them a basic understanding at least, so they can have a foundation upon which to build upon in their future. Now that applies to your soul education as well. You need a foundation. They are staging points. You could call them developmental points that you need to go through. You need to develop to understand a thing in the end, right? You can't just be presented with something without there being some development, right? So the fundamental development that happens from the soul's perspective is love, truth, faith, and humility. Unless you have those developments, there are many physical things you're never going to be able to do or understand. Teleportation is one of them.
Yeah. Which is why you've obviously taught for years and years about those fundamental principles, because without them,
Yep.
you just won't understand anything else.
No.
Yeah.
Impossible to. Impossible to. You need a foundation basis upon which to build your, you could say, your house, upon which you can build other things. Your education is dependent, your soul-based education is dependent upon developing a foundation for understanding and then utilizing that foundation and building upon it. Right? This is exactly what I've had to do. It's taken me 2,000 years to do it. To develop an understanding of some fundamental principles. Now, during that stage, I discovered some other things about God and what God could share with me, which sped up the process greatly. But again, I had to have a foundation of understanding of how they worked. And this is the important part, that you get a foundation for the operation of a thing.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
Yeah, and then also you're saying, I think before, about like when you do grow in love, God's love gives you more capacities. Is that part of this as well?
Yeah, fundamentally, I don't want to discuss it right now, but I'll
Yeah.
just give you a brief summary. The fundamental principle is that as you receive a substance from God, your capacity to understand increases. Because your capacity to understand now has increased, the more education you receive, the faster you can understand. Does that make sense? So it becomes like a you could say it's like a snowball going down a hill in a way, isn't it? Like you just got to get bigger as it's rolled down because it's going to collect more data. And what I'm saying to you is you're collecting more data with regard, if you collect more data with regard to the most important thing in the universe, God, the only real creature, the only real, not creature, the only real being in the universe, the only real soul in the universe, God, once you connect, you collect that data, there's a whole lot of other things that gives you as a result. And once you've got those other things, obviously understanding the more rudimentary issues of life is a lot easier. And when I say rudimentary, I use that very loosely because it's still highly complex. But to a person who's had some of the divine, less complicated than it was before. To understand.
Thank you very much.
Robert.
So Jesus is like developing like moral and ethics. Is that part of the staging as far as
Correct.
to get to truth?
Yes, because remember I said love is a very important aspect of how you learn. And morals and ethics are all connected to love. And morals is all connected to laws and truth.
Yep.
So morals and ethics are a very, very important part of your learning process. Unfortunately, you look at your school training, you weren't taught them. In fact,
There was no ethics.
and no ethics and also no morals taught at school, generally speaking. And the problem with that is that the average school on earth believes that if you teach morals and ethics, then you're teaching them religious concepts. But actually, from God's perspective, they are mathematical concepts, not religious concepts. There's a certain things you can do, and that's going to result in certain effects that you have because of what you did. And if you do the things that are more loving, the results will be positive, and you do the things that are less loving, the results will be negative. There's a feedback system with regard to truth. If you live in harmony with the truth, it will bring you positive outcomes. And if you live in disharmony with the truth, it'll bring you negative outcomes. There's a truth about love. So you could also say, if I live in harmony with love, there will be positive outcomes. And there'll be, if I live in disharmony with love, there'll be negative outcomes. And so fundamentally, if I live in disharmony with humility, faith, love, or truth, there are going to be negative outcomes. Right? But if I live in harmony with them, I will only experience positive outcomes. So very important to understand that my understanding, as I was saying to Eloisa earlier, is not just in my mind about these matters. It's to do with all of these things which are actually qualities or attributes, you could call them, and your development of them. You are not capable of understanding the complexity of the universe without developing them. So an example of that is in the spirit world, there's spheres, right, of existence. For those people who have not heard me talk before, there's spheres of existence. We'll talk about them a bit later. Every one of those spheres is a different gradient of truth, love, humility, and faith. A person who enters that sphere has now got all the information of that sphere available to them because their development in those areas are now substantial enough to receive that information. It's information that was not available to them when they were younger, when they were less developed than that. So unless you receive a certain type of development yourself, you will not understand things. It's impossible to understand things. In fact, beyond the sixth sphere of the spirit world, which is the perfect human lives in the sixth sphere of the spirit world, beyond that, you can't understand anything unless you've received those qualities from outside of yourself, from another source. It's impossible to even understand anything above the sixth sphere. So very important to understand how you grow, and that's what I would like to talk about. After we've talked about human life and life after death, I'd like to talk about how you develop, how you grow, because that's another question in itself in terms of what goes on there. But in terms of, for the purpose of this discussion coming up, you can see you're going to have to use your mind, you're going to have to use your senses, you're going to have to use your emotions, you're going to have to look at your beliefs, you're going to have to experiment, you're going to have to get educated and use all sorts of education as available to you, where you might have to read, you might have to listen to people talk and so forth in order to discover these truths. And that all makes logical sense, doesn't it, if you think about it? Very important that this desire for truth is developed. Unless you want to do all of those things I just mentioned, you will not get the truth inside of yourself. You will not have it. Unless you put some effort into it, you will not have it. Right? Thanks, sis.
So that means also if you have addictions through learning and through not want to see the whole truth,
Yep.
that you don't really...
You're going to have to deal with that, aren't you? It's like if you're wanting to be blind, then that's not good for your learning, is it? It's like me saying, I'm going to cover my sense of sight and then I'm going to learn everything. But I've closed down a sense. Is there anything of my learning going to be complete? Of course it cannot be. I need to use my senses properly And that means every sense I have. And many of our senses are not sight, sound, touch, hearing. They're also, as we talk about later, senses of like, and in terms of the ability to determine matter through the use of will, qualities such as humility and faith. These are all required in our learning, you know, and if you don't develop them, you just won't learn. You just won't. So it's very important to go, okay, if I look at my day-to-day life, and this is something to ponder before we have a break, I look at my day-to-day life, it makes sense to me. If I really want to be happy, I need to stop so much of my focus on just a mundane eking out an existence. I do need to eke out an existence. You know, I do need to eat, and I do need to sleep, and I do need to have a covering over my head, and I do, you know, in terms of, you know, protection from the elements, and I do need water, and there's some fundamental things I need, right? But beyond those things that are necessary for me to just be alive, I don't need any more than that if I want to learn truth. I just need to have the fundamentals of being alive and then have a desire to learn truth in every aspect I can, right? That's what I need. So, you know, having millions of dollars, that's not going to help me. You know, being wealthy is not going to help me. In fact, in many cases, it can hinder me. None of that's going to help me. What's going to help me is my focus on learning. That's what's going to help me. And the question then becomes, well, we're going to have a discussion in a minute about how the human is designed and everything. But do I want to learn it? And partly the reason why most people on earth don't really want to learn it is because they don't understand the advantages of learning it. But like anything, like I've said earlier, anything you learn will be to your advantage. And not only to your advantage now, it'll be to your permanent advantage. Not just now, for the rest of your life, and then if there is an afterlife, for that as well, it's going to be to that advantage as well. The more you learn now, the better your life will be. So my focus has been on becoming a proper student. Does that make sense? Just learning how to be a good student. Has been sort of the whole focus of my whole life, pretty much. I've learnt to become a student because I realised by being a student, I'm soaking up more knowledge. I never view myself as an expert because there's always more to learn, always more to know. Understand? There are certain things I do know that many people I realise and have met don't know, but in terms of what there is to know, I only know an infinitesimally small amount. Yeah. And so one of the thrills of life, you've got to learn this about life. One of the thrills of life is learning. And I don't just mean learning in my mind. I mean learning how feelings feel, learning how sexual feelings feel, learning how beliefs are formed, learning the substantial things of life. That's the thing that's worth learning, right? Then there's fascinating things, isn't there? Materials and other things that you see in the universe. Learning about them is fascinating too, but not as fascinating as the things that are going to benefit me in my life the most, which are the things that are going to bring me happiness as early as I could possibly expect to have it. Right? That's the thing that I'm going to benefit the most. So become students. Permanent students. Stop thinking that you just go to university, 4 years later, you're good. Now I can get on with the rest of my life. The rest of my life is the learning. That's the joy of the life. The rest of it is the learning. So focus on the learning. And it'll bring you joy. You'll be able to apply it, put it into practice, and as a result, have all these benefits that you wouldn't have had if you didn't learn. Yeah. So that's my recommendation. So the next presentation, which is about the human, Well, one of the most important things for you to learn about is yourself. You understand?
Yeah.
It's one of the most important things for you to understand. Like, how do you get the best out of this person you are? How do you get the best out of it? What's going to bring it joy? What's going to bring it life? What's going to bring it future? What's going to bring it happiness? You know, that's a very important thing to learn about. To my mind, if I could rewrite all the curriculums on earth, my first thing that I'd be learning about is God. The next thing I'd be learning about is the human.
Mm.
You know, how the human works and how it functions and the parts of the human and all this stuff, you know. That's what I'd be focusing my attention on. Now, in that, there are some things I'm going to have to understand about rudimentary things such as maths and science and language and other things like that, which is part of learning about the human and how the human learns. Right, so I need to learn that too. But if you have that focus, you can have an everlastingly joyous future by learning. So when you're just focused on day-to-day mundane, not learning, your life will become mundane. That's what will happen. So you'll have some fascination for learning. Shall we have a break now? Because I can feel those bladders. So, including my own, of course. So let's just have a 10-minute break to toilet. And what's the time?
12:28.
12:28.
Why don't we have a lunch break today?
Well, I was thinking we could do, I suppose. I suppose it's a natural time to have it, isn't it? Do we answer the extra couple of questions and then just have a lunch break?
Okay.
Maybe we should do that.
Okay.
Is everyone okay with that? So if we come, and then it was time.
And Jesus, you were talking about learning, and you mentioned that you were going to eventually know every language. So, in that learning stage, is that you finishing the process of the emotions, or are you going to have to actually study the languages at all, or how does that work?
Well, the capacity of your brain and the capacity of your emotions as they grow, they remove the limitations that are imposed upon our physical brain. So our physical brain, at the moment, because of the sin we're in actually, is the primary cause. The physical brain operates at 5 to 10% of its capacity. As you release your sin, the capacity of your brain improves. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. You get to a point where your capacity of brain is so improved, you can just see a thing for the first time and then utilize it. Now, language is very much like that. All you need to do so this is how our spirit friends learn. They just listen to people and they're talking the language and they work out the feelings and the connection to the feelings with the language they're using. And then they realise, oh, those are the words they use to describe those feelings, and then they just do the same. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So to do that, you can see you're going to need a more clever a brain that's working, not 5% working. Right? So that can only happen through your growth of in terms of your development. Does that make sense? Get rid of some sin and the brain will work better. When the brain works better, you'll understand more quickly. The more quickly you understand things, the easier you'll understand language, and so forth, right? So it's very important that you get that there are limitations upon the average person, emotional belief system limitations that are upon the actual person that cause the degradation of even the brain itself and how it's functioning. Now, the mind of the spirit body is less inhibited by those functions, but it only has the brain to work with. So your mind is, generally the average person's mind is working in the spirit world, is working at about, 30 or 40% capacity, when they first pass. But unfortunately, their physical brain on earth is a 5% capacity. So that means the 40% that they know in the sleep state can't get into their 5% brain and their awake state. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense.
So the problem with that, of course, is that there are things you can understand in your sleep state that now your brain is not able, in your physical body, is not able to translate into your wake state. And this is one reason why you can't remember your sleep state, right? So the same principle applies to learning anything, and that includes language.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you.
Taryn.
Before when you mentioned that a lot of people don't have like a desire for truth because they might not see the benefits.
Yep. You say having faith in the benefits, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. They don't have faith that it's going to benefit them.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
For people who say just want to put their belief in a religion,
Mm-hmm.
would you say it's kind of more that they don't want to take responsibility than do what you're saying?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of emotional reasons, Darren, why a person might want to believe in a religious faith that hasn't been scientifically proven or tested. Right? And if you look at almost all religious faiths on earth, that applies to all of them, where they have not been scientifically or mathematically tested. And so, you know, there's a whole lot of reasons why you might want to do that. There's many emotions for a start. And it's too hard to go to list them all because there's so many. But to give you an example of a few, if you have the feeling that you want to avoid responsibility, then the best thing to do is to make somebody else responsible. So if you make a book responsible for your life, then you don't have to take responsibility for your life. So if I make the Bible tell me what to do, then I don't have to take responsibility for what I did. That's a general thought. There's also things that you might not want to do, and a certain belief system tells you don't have to do that thing. Right? So there's certain things that the truth is saying you do have to do, but the belief is saying you don't have to do, and you might prefer to not have to do that, so you accept that belief. There's also other emotions such as, oh, my family's involved. So now to break away from a faith that has no scientific foundation, I would also have to break away from my family. Now that's a huge thing for the average person on earth to do. In fact, the average person on earth never breaks away from their family the whole time they're on earth. Right? They always feel bound to their family. And the trouble is the family's ideas, concepts, belief is going to determine your life if you do that. Right? So there's a fundamental flaw in doing that, but the average person feels so emotionally challenged and particularly very fearful about breaking away from family because they feel that family is my only support system. Right? They feel that if I break away from family, I'm breaking away from my own support, my only support system that I have. Right? And in feeling that, they are unwilling to accept truths that may cause them to break away from their family beliefs.
So is that more fear?
Yeah, very much so. Fear in lots of different areas, of course, yeah. Fundamentally, that's fear of my survival, that one. So a lot of people even have such a strong emotion about it that they feel that breaking away from family is going to cause their death, right? And certainly for many, they know that breaking away from family is going to cause punishment. You know, and if you're afraid of that, then of course you won't change your beliefs to suit, you know. So there's many people who live an emotional belief system, whatever that belief system is, that are tied into a lot of damaged emotions that cause them to accept that belief system, only to find that after they've passed, for example, to discover that all of those belief systems were false and they should have changed earlier. But you can't tell people when they're in a state of fear or judgment or criticism about beliefs that they haven't already agreed to. Difficult. Remember, there's a statement, isn't there, that many people say you've got to have an open mind to truth. The reality is all of you have open minds. You don't have open emotions. You've got to have open emotions to truth, not open minds. Because your emotions will determine what your mind is open to. Your mind, your intellect, being the smallest part of the way you determine truth, it can be open, but your emotions can be closed and you will not learn anything. Right? So what I find is the average person is quite open intellectually because there's not a lot of resistance on earth to being closed intellectually. So the average person is quite open intellectually, but when it comes to their emotions, they are extremely closed, right? And the extremity of the closed heartedness, we can call it, determines their learning ability. Right? Yeah, so when it comes to accepting a religious faith, fundamentally it's the closed heartedness that stops the mind from being logical. Like I said, the mind is just an input-output machine. And most people don't realise that the senses are going into it, but also the emotions are going into it. So most people think the mind is just sensory and it just has senses going into it. Well, if that was true, you wouldn't have an emotional resistance to a truth, right? But everybody's got emotional resistance to all sorts of truths, and that's because the emotions act as an inhibitor or an attenuator of your desire to learn truths, right? So your mind can be quite open, while at the same time your heart very closed, and you will not learn anything unless it's in agreement with what's already in your heart. And that's the fundamental reason why the average person on earth does not learn actual truths that God could share with them. Because they are far beyond the truths that humans know, and humans are generally very emotionally blocked to anything they don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just one more question with that. It
Yeah.
might be going a bit off track, but what I've found is a lot of people who are like in the New Age
Yep.
now going to Christianity,
Yep.
but very, very, very close to divine truth.
Yep.
Than what you're talking about.
Well, just as close as they were to when they were in New Age. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And they often people don't realise they're moving from one to the other just because of spirit influence. They don't understand the influences that are upon them emotionally. So they don't understand emotional learning, and so they think, when presented with a new thing, they can swap from one thing to another thing to another thing. I've seen some people in the course of the time I've been teaching go from no faith at all to New Age faith to Christianity to no faith at all again. Right? Now, how does that happen? If there's a truth, once it's an established truth inside of your heart, it's always going to be a truth, and you're not going to be able to change that. There are, like I said, there are absolute truths, and you can't change them. And once you learn them, you're not going to be able to change them. Right? The fact that you can switch from one to another faith indicates that you haven't learnt anything in your soul, in your heart.
There's like no foundation.
There's no foundation of understanding. The person who does that indicates through their behaviour that they had no foundation of understanding from the beginning. Does that make sense? The key to any learning is to get a foundation of understanding. And this is a very, very important part of learning for your future. Foundation of understanding will stand you in good stead for every learning. Right? When you're just going from one to another on a whim, which is fundamentally what many people are doing, they're just going, oh, I don't like that anymore, I like this now. Oh, these have got good friends there, so I'm going to go there instead. Oh, these people seem kinder than those people, so I'm going to go towards them instead. Right? Rather than being based on any scientific mathematical fact. But when I say fact, I'm not just talking about intellectual, of course. I'm talking about the sensory, emotional facts of life. When you're not based on all of those things and there's no truth there, then you've blown about like a wave, there's a Bible verse that says that a person who doubts is like a boat driven in the wind without a rudder. You just go wherever the wind blows. And the average person on earth does exactly that their entire life. I don't recommend it. Because if you do that, you'll be governed by what everybody else thinks all the time. And never by what is the truth. Yeah. A person who has established a good foundation for learning, which is based on this truth principle, once you've developed that good foundation for learning, every piece of learning will benefit from that foundation. So we're going to have the learning about the soul next, but that's going to benefit from the foundation of the desire for truth. Right? Every learning you can imbibe will benefit from it. And that applies to physical things, anything to do with materials, anything to do with substances, anything to do with chemicals. The more you involve the basic fundamental principles of understanding, it'll benefit your understanding in every area of life, not just in one.
Yeah, I love that.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, thank you.
And if you think about it, a clever God would have made such a system. Yeah? Rather than this seemingly indeterminate system that the human lives under on Earth, right? Yeah. So it makes sense, doesn't it? France.
So coming from the culture I come from, and
The German culture?
yes, the German culture, and growing up in my family and being a man, I can see that developing the intellect, I've done very much of it, like almost increasingly decoupled from the heart, which now I see as a serious problem.
It's a major impediment to your future.
Yes.
Yes.
And I mean, I can already see this.
Yes.
And yeah. So you said before that we have to unblock learning.
Yes, that's right. It's sort of like you've got these emotions that have been shut down, or certain emotions that determine that you're only going to learn with your intellect. You're not going to emotionally participate in your learning. Obviously, that needs to change, for you to learn what God wants to share, the universal truth. That's the thing that needs to change. It's the thing that most men find difficult to change. Yeah, women generally find it a bit easier, but men find it a bit more difficult. For that reason, because many men have decoupled their heart from their head and tried to look at everything logically rather than emotionally logically. So there's no emotional development. So many men I meet are like children emotionally. They're like undeveloped, 1-year-olds.
And it's very illogical.
And ironically, very illogical. Because they're using one apparatus, the intellect, without a number of different senses as inputs. And so you can see what's happening. It's like a brain sitting on a shelf with no inputs. And so you think you're being logical and everything while you're being very illogical. Yeah, and it's a very silly thing to do, but most people are thinking, I'm only learning with my mind, I'm only learning with my mind, and that's the only thing I'm learning by. But if you look at it logically, even that is not true. You're learning how to use your senses. You're learning how to use your feelings. You're learning beliefs that are driving your faith, your desires. So you're learning far more than learning with your mind. Yep.
And it's so amazing to see children learning, like within 2 years they learn the language plus the physics of the planet.
Some within 2 years learn 5 languages.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
So my original question would be like, okay, how to learn unblock.
Yeah, well, that's a discussion all of its own, isn't it? And there's plenty of material I've already given you, Franz. If you look at online with all the thousands of hours of videos I've already done, there's plenty of material there about how to unblock things. But it is going to be an emotionally difficult experience. And this is what most people that are adverse to. Most people don't realize they are blocked emotionally, or even if they do realize I am blocked emotionally, they say to themselves, but if unblocking me emotionally means feeling some painful emotions, I don't want to do that. Do you know what I mean? It is going to require feeling some painful emotion to unblock yourself emotionally. And bear in mind, of course, your emotions are only one set of the functions that you need to unblock. You need to unblock your beliefs, your emotions, your sexual behavior, your sexual feelings. You need to unblock your senses. Many of you have detuned even from your bodily senses, where you can't even see what's behind you anymore. Just think about what I said.
Yeah.
There are senses in your spirit body that can feel what's behind you. but many of you use them, right? You can feel somebody looking at you and you turn exactly to the person who's looking at you and you see them looking at you. You just use that sense. You understand? But you're blocked to it mostly. Right? You can't feel when somebody loves you, for example. You can't feel their love. You can only see through their behaviour they love you. But you can't actually feel they love you. Right? But there are many senses you have, like many of you have experienced when, you thought about somebody and the next day they call you. Like many of you have experienced this, right? So you know there's other senses operating. Well, how about learning about them and incorporating them into your search for truth? So this is going to be a process for us. At the moment you're very frustrated, I know. That's it, like you're very frustrated with, my mind's, I get told constantly here, my mind's not working, I don't understand. Yeah, you get very frustrated. Well, part of the painful emotion is the frustration. You're going to have to learn how to feel that and cope with that and deal with that and go through it. Does that make sense? That's a part of the unlearning process, is feeling the frustration, feeling the anger that comes up when you're told constantly you don't understand something. Right? You need to let yourself feel these things. Make sense? Yep. So when we talk about the soul and your bodies, which we'll do later today, I want to always pull you back to this idea or concept of the ways in which you will learn. Because you're going to find in the discussion they're just challenging things that come up in the discussion, and then if you're blocked to them, you just feel, you need to feel which sense is blocked here, which part of me is not functioning now because I've got some kind of emotional impediment or physical impediment or sensory impediment to grasping this. Because the presentation of truth depends a lot upon your being completely open, not just your mind being open. So many of you, your minds are already open, but the emotions are the things that are going to determine how much truth you actually can absorb. Does that make sense?